get that going. So if there's anyone that can't join us in person, they'll be able to join us later through the recording. So thank you for being with us today, and happy Preservation Month. May, as I'm sure you all know, is Historic Preservation Month. And we are excited to be deep in it. And I hope you're doing fun things in your community to celebrate as well. Thank you for joining us. We appreciate it. And I just wanted to share that this Lunch and Learn is part of a series we are doing of Lunch and Learns to support our professional members. It's also open to the public, but the content is specifically geared towards our professional members and the things that will help them to accomplish their mission and do the work they need to do. So as we go along, if you would like to ask questions, you can pop them in the chat, or we'll have a time for questions at the end if you would like to. But either way, we will just go ahead and get started. I will just also share with you guys that we got a new camera on my computer, so I'm trying to figure that out as we go too. So thank you for being patient. All right, just to get started, I always like to kind of start our conversations with, why do we do the work that we do in historic preservation and cultural resource protection? And I just like to share some of the stories about why I do what I do. And oftentimes I kind of tell the story of the first building, that I lost that was important to me. And that's the building to the left there. It was my grandparents' house, and I'm the little girl on the right. But today I wanted to share a different story. Here at the Florida Trust, throughout the month, we've been featuring people's stories about Florida historic places that matter to them. And one of many, many historic places in Florida that matter and have been of impact in my life is the Ringling Museum in Sarasota. Hopefully you guys have all been there. The Ringling is the State Art Museum of Florida, and I think it's a cultural treasure and certainly a historic treasure. It has a 66-acre estate of John and Mabel Ringling, a circus museum, amazing grounds, amazing views of the bay, and the Cottazon, which is like an Italianate home that John had built here in Sarasota. And I love the space because of what it says about Florida's unique history, this kind of idea that people could come here and create this sort of wonderland of whatever they wanted Florida to look like and be. They could create that. Of course, that took money, so not everyone could do that. But I grew up in Port Charlotte, Florida. I can't make this work. I grew up in Port Charlotte, Florida. I was born in Clearwater, but I went to school in Port Charlotte. And so when we were young, we would come up to Sarasota and to the Ringling to go to the museum, to go on field trips. There was a Renaissance fair that they held on the grounds there for a while. I don't know if they still do. But it became just such an important part of our lives. My grandparents would come down from Alabama and we would take them to the museum. So I have a picture of me when I was my children's age, standing with my grandparents at the Ringling. And then this is a picture from probably about 7 or 8 years ago of my daughters and I at the Ringling. So I share this with you just so you guys can know some of the passion that drives and motivates me. But also I'd love for y'all to think about places in Florida that kind of resonate with you and your story. And I'd love to hear those. We would love to share those with others. If you want to throw them in the chat, you could do that. You can email me. But we would love to share people's personal experiences with the historic places that make Florida unique. So that's a little bit about kind of why I am motivated to do the work that I do. And then I also, when I start out, like to kind of do a level set where we talk about what historic preservation means. It's a very broad term, and all the times that I've talked and presented about historic preservation, I've never had two people answer it in the same way. And if anybody wants to give a whirl and throw their definition in the chat, I will record it and keep it, because I have kind of a collection of what preservation means to people that I keep. But it is a very broad term, and it means different things for different people. So here is one definition that I'm proposing that we work with as we think through our presentation today. Hopefully it works for you. And I include in it the memories of those who came before us, the memory of those who owned and lived in historics and of a community in historic places, a community, the people who designed and built it, and the memory of what may have happened in that space. And so the photo I chose to include here is of Fort Mose Historic State Park in St. Augustine. In 1738, the Spanish governor of Florida chartered the settlement for those fleeing slavery from the English colonies in the Carolinas. and it is a National Historic Landmark. It is listed on the National Register, of course, but there are no of those original buildings that remain. So I include this to kind of just share with us that the definition of preservation doesn't just mean, a building in and of itself. Of course, buildings are a very important part of it, but it's not all that there is to preservation. And it can also encompass a community and the culture in a space that no longer has buildings to tell that story. It is a better story if the buildings are there, though. So here's what we're going to learn today. We've got 4 key things we're going to learn. We're going to just do a quick overview of our advocacy work and legislative priorities for this year. We're going to talk about lobbying and advocacy overall. We're going to talk about advocacy communications and how to do that effectively. And then we're going to hit on the importance of collaboration. And then we'll wrap it all up with next steps. So just real briefly, in case you don't know, we are the Florida Trust for Historic Preservation. We are a Florida statewide nonprofit that works to protect our state's history and heritage. Here's our mission statement, if you'd like to read that. And my name is Melissa Wiley. I'm the CEO and president of the Florida Trust. And we are based here in Tallahassee. And we are a statewide organization. So we work with preservationists from around the state to drive preservation through advocacy, education, awareness, and things, fun projects like that. Here again is our mission, and I'm showing our key strategic functions that support our mission. And I'm just sharing this with you so that you can see that advocate is one of our 4 strategic pillars. So it's really important to what we do. It is a way that we can be a truly scalable organization that equally impacts everyone in Florida. So it's a very important key to what we do. So before we kind of get started about the 101 thing that is applicable for everyone, I was going to share with you what our legislative priorities were for this year. And then as we go through these, I'm kind of almost using them as case studies so that we're going to kind of suss from there the different tactics that we use to kind of achieve that strategic priority. And of course, questions, put them in the chat or save them to the end. I'm happy to talk about that more. But here was our 4 legislative priorities for the year: to establish a state historic tax credit, protect Florida's abandoned historic cemeteries, fully fund the fiscal year 24 historic preservation special category grant list. And then we worked to amend a preemptive bill to remove local regulation over demolition. So those were the 4 key things that we were focusing on during this legislative session. And here is us in action during that legislative session. This is kind of a montage of the work that we did. And it just shows kind of the key importance of engaging with lawmakers, relationship building, communicating, and also Florida's a big state. So we had to get stakeholders from all over the state to come in and make those conversations meaningful with lawmakers. Because of course, if you're going to have a conversation with a lawmaker and you have a constituent in the room, then you're making a much bigger impact. So I wanted to just take a second and share for us a really important piece of our strategy was having on our board a board member, Mark Zugli, who is our legislative affairs chair, who is deeply entrenched in the work of legislative action in the state. He's been working with lawmakers for many years. He's a legislative consultant. So he has relationships, he understands the process. And having him on board with us has really helped our strategic advocacy work over the years since he's been with us. I think it's been about four years now, maybe 5. But having those key players who have some of that knowledge is really important. Mark is the standalone picture there on the bottom row, kind of in the middle, where it looks like somebody's running, because he's running to achieve our legislative missions there. So that's Mark. So thank you, Mark, if you're on the line. So our first legislative focus was to establish a state tax credit. We worked with stakeholders from around the state. This was our second year really pushing this initiative. It's called the Main Street Historic Tourism and Revitalization Act. It was filed in the House as Bill 499 and in the Senate as 288. And it would provide a tax credit of up to 20% of total eligible costs for rehabilitation of a certified historic structure. And then a 30% credit for those eligible structures that are in a officially designated Florida Main Street community. So that would be a really great tool and incentive for preservation in Florida. That was a key thing that we were advocating for again this year. So we, as part of our strategy, I'm showing here some of the communication tools that we use to achieve and work through that strategic goal. We visited with sponsors and other key legislators routinely before and during the session. We spoke in support of it all, community hearings. We worked so that there were others in the audience at committee hearings that were waving in support to demonstrate that they were supporting the bill. We had another lunch and learn similar to this one where we talked about it. We created information sheets, the economic impacts of historic tax credit. We did a little fun branding campaign for Valentine's Day where we said "I love old buildings," and it was a reason and excuse to engage with our sponsors and staff members and other key supporting legislators, but also to remind them that we're here and this is what we do. And we had all kinds of other communication tools, but this is just some of the pieces that we use to move this forward. Another tool we used in this work was creating a new group within the framework of the Florida Trust that specifically focused on the tax credit work. It included professionals who have experience working with tax credits in other states, and those who have helped get tax credits passed in those states, and then those who are protecting existing tax credits in other states. Just so y'all know, Florida is the only state among our neighbors without a tax credit and one of only 14 states overall without a tax credit in the nation. So we're in the minority, and it's a very important tool that could help incentivize preservation. It makes really good economic sense. I know I'm preaching to the choir, so I'm going to stop talking about it. But we created this group so we had professionals that we were able to hear from them and learn from them and engage with them specifically around this one strategy. So we created different collaborative communication pieces to support that. We created a website to support it. We had ongoing weekly meetings during session to hear from them, to get their feedback. This tour we did in January, I believe. So at the well, no, that's not true. We did it in March at the beginning of session. It's in Jacksonville. It's the Union Terminal Warehouse, and it is a big giant building kind of across from the stadium, and it's under construction. It has been empty for years. It is utilizing the federal historic tax credits to help a big rehabilitation project. There's going to be retail on the first floor. There's going to be lofts. There's a significant number of affordable housing units that could be included in here. Workforce housing, which is a big issue in Jacksonville and other communities throughout the state. So it was a great place that we could bring people to tell the physical story of how a tax credit could actively change communities. So this picture is from that walkthrough, and Columbia Ventures, who is one of our alliance members, owns the building and is doing the work there. And so they hosted this tour, which included a case study that they created. We kind of helped them with that, and the economic impact of the property to the city overall. And it outlined how a state tax credit, if we had that, could have increased the number of affordable and workplace housing units that were in there. So we had great media turnout. You can see some of the cameras there in the picture. There were 7 state lawmakers who attended. Secretary of State Cord Byrd attended the event, and we did this right at the beginning of sessions so that as they heard in their committee meetings and in their conversations about our tax credit, they had sort of this in the back of their mind, is what it would look like and how it could help Florida. So the second thing that we focused on was protecting Florida's abandoned historic cemeteries. This was House Bill 49 and Senate Bill 430, so a very different kind of advocacy work. It would create a historic cemeteries program within the Division of Historical Resources, and create guidelines for state agencies, local governments, and developers to identify, locate, and maintain abandoned and historic cemeteries with specific attention towards the African American cemeteries in the state. And it was really kind of born from the African American Cemetery Task Force that was funded a few years ago. So here we were part of a group of people who collaborated together to get this legislation passed. The bill enjoyed strong bipartisan support from lawmakers and also from community advocates, including our organization, the NAACP, Thousand Friends of Florida, and statewide archaeological and anthropological groups. So in the committee hearings, what we heard through some of the advocacy work we were doing is people sharing their personal stories. And I think this is the personal kind of quote here and personal story of Representative Caruso, who was the vice chair of the State Affairs Committee, which was one of the stops for this bill this year. But I really think that capturing these personal stories and sharing them as part of your advocacy strategy is a really important tool to consider when you're doing your work. The third thing we focused on was fully funding the fiscal year 24 Historic Preservation Special Category Grant List. And here is, I think most of you are probably more aware of this than maybe some of the other things that we were doing, but here is all of the preservation grants that would have been in Florida in fiscal year 2024. It's 33 projects with a price tag of about 8.5 million. And our ask here was just that the legislature fully fund these grants. And this picture here is kind of a little book that we put together to tell the stories of each of those 33 projects. Each page had a picture and a story and what would be done with the money if they are funded. And when we would go to have our conversations with lawmakers, we would have their district's projects outlined or kind of marked so that we could say, and here are the things in your district that would benefit, and here's how your community would be benefited from these grants. So it is an example of a communication tool and materials that helps to tell the story. But of course, you have to have those meetings with lawmakers. You have to be engaging with your stakeholders across the board and asking them to also support it for those tools to be impactful and helpful. And then the fourth thing that was our focus for this year was different than the other three. The first three were asking for something. And on the fourth, we were asking for changes to legislation that we did not advocate for. It was just sort of legislation that we were faced with. And so our strategy was to work with other groups and other preservationists to amend that legislation so we could protect Florida's historic places. So many of you have probably heard about this. It received a lot of media coverage. It was talked about in a lot of communities around the state because it would have had a big oversized impact, but it was State Bill 1346, sponsored by Senator Avila, and House Bill 1317, sponsored by Representative Roach. We just called them 13s because obviously we both start with 13, so it was an easy way to keep up with them. But if passed, the bills would have allowed for the demolition of historic structures, which was one piece of our concern, but the other piece was it would have also allowed for the rebuilding of oversized and inappropriate replacement buildings in Florida's coastal historic districts. So it would have eliminated much of the local government's abilities to say what could be built back in historic neighborhoods. Not just historic neighborhoods, but we were primarily worried about the historic neighborhoods and the impact there. So for this strategy and the strategic advocacy function, we, preservationists, nonprofits, cities came together to work towards amending the language to allow for the preservation of important historic preservation places in Florida like Key West, Miami Beach, West Palm Beach, St. Augustine, St. Petersburg, Pensacola, Fort Myers. This would have had a really tremendous impact throughout the state. So for this sort of case study, I would say that one of the things that we really did is we tried to be active listeners and to understand what was driving the creation of the bill. We met with the sponsors, we talked to the sponsors' staff, we sat in on committee hearings, and we were understanding that there was a concern that they wanted to have their communities be safe. And they wanted there to be the ability, especially after hurricanes, to build back in ways that were timely and of the best interest for their communities. So we heard that and we tried to understand that. And so our sort of strategic plan here wasn't to pull it, it wasn't to kill it, it was to work with them to amend the language. So there were some exclusions that were carved out from the bill, and the exclusions that it landed with were just for districts, National Registered districts. But we tried to have added to that. So it was National Registered districts. It was resources that were individually listed on the National Register. It would be for locally designated historic resources and main streets. So we tried to add to that carve out so there were more exclusions. The picture that you see here is a webinar that was hosted by the Miami Design Preservation League. This is Daniel Seraldo. He's the executive director of that organization. They did a great job stepping in and being leaders in this initiative because obviously the impact to Miami Beach would have been very significant. So they really stepped up. They were able to tell that personal story. It was very, very personal. When they would go talk to the lawmakers, they would be able to say, Miami Beach, the Art Deco district, these are the things that could be impacted. We could say those words too, but we represent the whole state. So there was a little bit more of an impact that came when the people from Miami were saying, in Miami, this is a big, big risk. So this is a webinar that Miami Design Preservation League hosted sort of midway through session. On the webinar, there was stakeholders interested in fighting the bills. We spoke, I think the mayor of the city of Miami Beach spoke. There were a lot of people, the mayor of St. Augustine spoke. So we had great support from local elected officials. But the thing that was important, and I think really powerful here, is that there was also media that was invited to the webinar. And Daniel's organization, I think, really took the lead in doing the media outreach and packaging that in a way that was attractive for the media. So there was some really great media coverage that you may have seen in the Miami Herald and other outlets that told the story in a really understandable, relatable way for preservation. So that was a great tool they utilized during session, was that webinar and the continuing visits they made with lawmakers. We also worked with other organizations, including the National Trust for Historic Preservation. So you saw that our fourth thing that we're going to talk about is the importance of collaboration. So we'll hit on that more there, but really we have so much of an opportunity to speak more loudly when we are joining our voices with other organizations. And that is certainly true for the National Trust. When they sent out their preservation alert to their members in Florida, that hit 16,000 supporters. And some of that is absolutely going to be an overlap with Florida Trust stakeholders and members. We know because I think we're the only statewide nonprofit that offers joint membership with the National Trust. So we know there's overlap. But there were many other people that were not Florida Trust members that got this message. So that is another important. So here we're talking about the tool of these online alerts and the online platforms where you can reach out to your lawmakers, but also the importance of collaboration and grassroots advocacy. And then the picture on the right is a graphic that our team created that talked about specifically why demolition review is important. Because as you're doing your advocacy work, you want to keep in mind that the audience that you're engaging with may very well have different experiences and understanding of the words that we use kind of on a daily basis to talk about preservation. So if we just say that the bill would eliminate demolition review and weaken design review, that's kind of maybe people are gonna glaze over a little bit. So we tried to have that language be something that was more digestible and relatable. So we had this graphic, and then in the call to action in the social media place, we would say specifically, here's some things that demolition review could do. Include just having the opportunity to document the space and the stories that can be told there before it's lost forever. So that is kind of a brief overview of, so I'm sorry I went so quick through it, but I know we're here to talk about other things as well, so we can talk about it more in the chat if you'd like to. But I wanted to transition now to lobbying and advocacy. I know for our, oh, my animation didn't work. There's a picture behind here. Well, okay, you guys are just gonna have to trust me. If you think about lobbying as a circle, this is all the activities that you could do that would be lobbying. Advocacy would be a bigger circle that surrounds that. You can do a lot of engaging with lawmakers that is under the umbrella of advocacy that isn't direct lobbying, although obviously lobbying is a way that you can engage in advocacy. And I'm not trying to be nerdy or wonky. I'm just trying to kind of make this a clear distinction, because I think there is a lot of misunderstanding about what nonprofits can do in relations to advocacy. So I know not everyone on our call is a nonprofit, so it may not be immediately applicable to you, but I did just want to take a minute to kind of call out that all lobbying is advocacy, but not all advocacy is lobbying. And so you can see here the sort of different activities in both buckets there. And because our audience today is our professional members, and I know that does include some nonprofits, I just wanted to clarify that nonprofits may do both advocacy and lobbying. I know sometimes there's a misunderstanding that that is not true, but it is. Absolutely, nonprofits can engage in both. Those who receive payment for lobbying should register with the state. So for instance, I am a registered lobbyist, even though I just represent the Florida Trust. I'm just paid by this one entity that employs me. I'm not a professional lobbyist. And so there's different, when you're filling out that forms, there's different things that you can select to best describe the kind of work that you're doing. But also nonprofits should keep track of meetings with lawmakers, just for their overall sort of strategic planning, but also so that you can include that in your IRS Form 990. That's one of the questions that is asked about your nonprofit. So you want to try to keep your arms around that as you move through your advocacy work. And sort of the tipping point and what nonprofits need to be aware of and look for is that charitable nonprofits like the Florida Trust, 501c3s, the law says, the regulation says they may not use substantial resources for lobbying. It is not prohibited, it just says they may not use substantial. So these organizations have the right to lobby for issues they believe in, just like the work that I just described the Florida Trust does. It is only when there are lobbying involved that there is that kind of threshold that you have to keep in mind. So what I would advise is if you're a nonprofit and you are interested in engaging in not just advocacy, but specifically lobbying, that you engage with an accountant to talk about where that threshold might be for you. And another option would be to consider an H election, which would allow your organization to more precisely report the amount of money spent. So you wouldn't have that kind of ambiguity around the term substantial and unsubstantial. But overall, I would just recommend, if you're concerned about it and definitely want to be lobbying, to talk to your accountant to get some more specific information about that. A lot of what I would think that your organization should do is in the advocacy bucket. So this is sharing best practices and stories. It's talking about the impact of historic preservation overall, maybe the economic impact of preservation. It's updating your membership on different legislation and policies that might impact you, as long as you're not asking for a specific ask. Ask your lawmaker to support the tax credit would be a specific ask. But if you're just letting them know about what is going on with those one or two different things you're tracking, then that would just be general advocacy. So hopefully that's helpful for some of you. I know it's a question I get a lot, so I just wanted to share this piece with you. Our next takeaway for the day is around advocacy communications. So this is when you're at the step in the process where you want to figure out how your organization can be most useful in the work of advocating to support your cause. So I've kind of broken it down into these 5 buckets and like a process. So you work to set the strategy, you build relationships, so you have sort of fertile ground for whatever your ask and strategy is going to be. You determine your stakeholders. So who are the key people you want to engage with? When we were thinking through who our sponsors were going to be for the tax credit, for instance, we definitely thought of folks who were going to be on the Ways and Means Committee, or we went with our House sponsor, Representative Paula Stark, because she was a Main Street director. So for her, the understanding of how Main Streets work and the real positive impact it could have in Main Streets throughout the state was a very valuable thing. And when we met with her, we knew from our conversations that she was going to be fighting very hard for this initiative. It meant something to her. So we kind of really thought through that process of who the stakeholders are. And then you want to think also, who are the staff members of these key stakeholders? You want to engage with them as well. Think through the legislative process and what part along those stops do you want to make sure you are engaging and communicating with key people there. Then you're going to want to think through your communication platforms, the way that the tools that you have to tell those stories to the key stakeholders, growing on those relationships you've built to work towards your strategy. Something that was new for us that we developed this year, a couple of things that we did around communication platforms that we learned from previous years, was we needed to do a weekly advocacy update for our stakeholders. And this is a different distribution list than just members. So it was a self-selecting list. We said, we're going to be doing this. We're going to be sharing with you every step of the way what's going on with these 4 key strategies. If you want to get weekly updates on where we are, let us know. We'll add you to this mailing list. So there are members who do not want a weekly update on what's going on in Tallahassee during session. So those folks didn't get bombarded with emails that they didn't want. But there are lots of folks around the state that did want to know that may not be members. So they're different lists. And overall, it's a great way for us as a nonprofit to grow our brand and the awareness of the work we're doing, but it's also getting the right information to the right people. So that was something new that we did this year. We created that distribution list, that self-selecting distribution list. And then we also had to create the content. So every week we were at the Capitol anyway. So we were just gathering the stories, gathering the updates that we wanted to share. So we had photos every week. For each of the 4 things we were following, we had updates, we had asks. Here's the key people. Here's the committees that's going to be heard in next week. Here's the date and time if you can come. Here's who you should email if you want to support this. All of that kind of very granular stuff to enable people to make a difference, because we wanted to be the way that we were connecting people to their passion and what they were passionate about and their lawmakers. We wanted to be that conduit. So we wanted to have those tools and resources available for folks. So when they wanted to support the grants, they had everything they needed to do that right there. And then the last piece in the advocacy process is obviously to actually do the work and then see how you're doing with the work, and then keep going, refine, and just start over, rinse and repeat. And that's the part of the process we're in right now as we consider next year's 2024 legislative session that starts January 9th. So we don't even have a whole calendar year to emotionally recover from this. We got to get back in the swing of things. And I just was going to add, under communication platforms, when we did our weekly email updates and blogs, that is a outward facing communication tactic that we did. But we also added 2 additional sort of internal business communication ads that really, I think, help us to do our work better, to be that connector for our stakeholders and the lawmakers, and to be more of a help for advocacy in our communities. So one, we already mentioned a little bit, we talked about the Tax Credit Alliance and those weekly phone calls. So we had that focus every Monday morning where here's where we are, here's what we need to do. And we kind of kept that going every Monday. And then another thing that we did is every Friday, there was sort of like a leadership call with our board president, me, Alyssa Lotane, our SHPO, Mark Zubli, who I mentioned is our legislative affairs chair, and our internal legislative affairs coordinator. We all got together and talked about what happened and what we needed to do to plan for the next week. So it was kind of just an internal sort of level setting. Here's how we did, here's what's going on, here's where things moved, just keeping us all on the same page. And I think just doing that internal work, even though most of our stakeholders would never have seen that, and it enabled us to do a better job. So as you're thinking through the work that you would like to do for advocacy, I would recommend, when you're thinking of communication platforms, don't just think about the ones that are externally facing, but think about internally how you can keep all of your probably fragmented stakeholders on the same page. All right, so now we get to talk about the fun part, the communication platforms and tactics that we used. And I hope that when we get to our questions that you will all share some examples that you've had with these or questions you might have about these, so we can keep that conversation going, because there are many, many tools and platforms out there that we could use. But first, I would say, and this could be an entire separate conversation that we could have, but I would say to be thoughtful about your organization's brand overall before you get too far down the road with your advocacy strategy and your advocacy plan. And much of the relationship building work that we did and that Mark Zubli really helped us to do was part of that branding piece. We wanted to make sure that before we had specific asks that we asked people, that we had relationships with stakeholders that they knew who we were. It seems pretty basic, but we wanted to have people know who we were. And even bigger than that, we wanted them to know what historic preservation is. So for at least 2 years before we even began the tax credit work, we would have meetings with lawmakers and staff where we would just talk about what preservation is. We would talk to lawmakers, we would learn from them the historic resources in their districts that are important to them. We would try to get tours going in those areas if we could. If it was a place they maybe didn't know about or had always wanted to engage in, we would try to get up, one-on-one meetings, or maybe even a ribbon cutting event or a media avail at a historic resource. We tried to make connections in their districts, with historic places that matter to them in their community. But overall, we wanted them to know what historic preservation was, and we wanted them to know who we were. So I would say for you all to think through as you're going through this process, what is your organization? Who is your organization? Is it visually recognizable? Do you consistently use your brand in a way that it helps to build recognition? So if over the years they see your leave behinds 10 times, it begins to help. It begins to really help with that visual recognition of your brand and the work you're doing. So I would really advocate for thinking through that branding piece. And that includes some of those communication things we talked through with the case study. So if you want to have a nice solid brand, you want to have messaging that is really clear and concise and is in language that is immediately approachable for all audiences. One thing that I always advocate for is that organizations and individuals have elevator pitches. So if you would like to, you can imagine that you're in an elevator and a lawmaker walks in that elevator, maybe your mayor walks into that elevator, the doors close, and he's like, hey, what are you doing? Who are you? Who are you with? And maybe you have like that 30 seconds where you can really quickly say, this is who our organization is, and this is who I am. And people who do great jobs with elevator pitches are always the people who are able to say the answer to that question in a way that is engaging for lawmakers, they're engaging for grandmothers, they're engaging for 9-year-olds. Simple is best. So when I first started here, we had our board of the Floor Trust practice their elevator pitch. I played Prince, so they had like that elevator song kind of going in their minds, and then they got together and crafted their elevator pitch. So think through the branding of yourself and your organization, your elevator pitch, and how you describe who you are and the work you do. And I would do all of that before I started worrying about office visits. And remember that we don't want to use jargon, and we want message that is clear and relatable. So that's more challenging than you would think. So kind of just work through that. And if any of you guys can do a great job at this, please let me know, because I still am not 100% sure that my family members know what I do. So we're always working toward greatness. Another platform is, of course, office visits. You can do those here in Tallahassee during session or during committee weeks before sessions starts even. But even more impactful potentially is doing those office visits when they are in district. So kind of absolutely, it's a less stressful time. It's a way that you can build your brand, engage with them, just let them know who you are, maybe prime the pump for when you might have some specific asks for during session, but kind of consider those office visits. Another thing that we kind of think through in this sort of vein is if you are having events. So if you're on Main Street and you have an event, or we have a conference coming up, Preservation on Main Street, it's going to be in Ocala. So part of our work for planning that event is inviting lawmakers to attend. And McLean, who is the chair of the Ways and Means Committee in the House, he just happens to be from that area. So we are absolutely trying to focus on getting him to attend the event, to be there, but also to say a few words, to get to speak. And then we'll invite some media so they can get that picture, which is the benefit for that lawmaker. It's building the relationship. And then also the Secretary of State is going to be there, because the Main Street program in the Division of Historical Resources is under the Department of State. So the Secretary of State, Ford Bird, is going to come to the Main Street. He's going to do a walkthrough. There's going to be great photo avails there for photographers and news outlets. But wouldn't it be awesome for other lawmakers if they got to kind of tag along and experience that too? So their faces are in those pictures. So it's building opportunities for mutual benefits. So it's a benefit for us, it's a benefit for the Preservation on Main Street Conference, but also there could be some benefit for the lawmakers as well in those situations. So think through what's going outside of session in your communities, and see if there are ways to engage your lawmakers in those, and to get them out in the community and engage with your brands. Another piece that is really important is collaborative coalition building. We've talked through some of those as we did the kind of case studies that were our 4 strategic advocacy focuses for the year. But I really can't speak enough to how important this is, and how your voice will be louder by speaking with others and saying the same thing. So we have been, and we'll talk more about collaboration next, so I won't go into that too much, but I think that has really helped to move the needle for all 4 of the strategic advocacy initiatives that we talked about for this year. I think collaboration was probably the single biggest piece that supported all of those. So I hope that you will ask questions about that or share examples of that as we get into the questions piece. So then as you move through in the communication platforms and tactics to the physical piece, when I do office visits, I always like to have a 1-pager that I leave behind. And it's a branding document, absolutely. But it says overall what your organization is, why it exists, and it has that visual tie-in to who you are, so it's on brand. And then if there's an ask associated with it, that ask is right there, very clear, big font, taller than everything else on the page. And then, your business card. You're always going to want to have your business card when you go for these visits. So put all that together. So when we do the visits, we have our 1-pager, but we also have a whole folder that we dedicate for our work. So we would have a 1-pager for each of our 4 initiatives. Then we would have a 1-pager about what the heck Florida Trust is. And then behind that 1-pager, we have our magazine, whatever the most recent edition of the magazine is, so they can learn more about preservation in Florida if they want to. And then we give some stickers, which is not a gift because they're very, very inexpensive. So we don't have to count it as a gift. But over the years, as we continue doing this, we go to more and more offices where they have our coasters out already, or they have our stickers on the wall. So our brand is growing throughout the Capitol. And I should mention from the brand perspective that one thing that we've done for the past few years is we do have coasters with our logo on it. And if you look at the picture here of the Florida Trust House, you can see that circular image there. That is the stained glass that is in the dome of the historic Capitol. And we have transformed that into our logo because it was the work and campaign to save the historic Capitol that was really the impetus for the founding of our organization. So we kind of consider that the birth of preservation in Florida. And so that's why that stained glass dome image there is our logo. So every year for the last 3 years, before session starts, the night before, we get into the Capitol. We won't talk about how. And we have little coasters with that dome image and the Florida Trust on the front, and on the back, there's just a little tiny brief story about how we were born to basically save the historic Capitol, which is an amazing, beautiful building that everybody can relate to and understand and experience how terrible it would be if it was lost. So we just paper offices and staff desks and public areas with our coaster with the logo on it. So right off the bat, when lawmakers get into their offices, they have that brand and that story in their space to engage with. So by the time we come in with our leave behind and 1-pagers, hopefully they're at least going to visually recognize our stained glass logo thing. Another important tool that we utilize is media alerts, events where we invite the media, and press releases. I would just say generally a media alert is a very short, like 1-page document that you send to media outlets that are targeted for a specific event. So when we had the Union Terminal Warehouse hard hat tour in Jacksonville, we sent a media alert out to the Jacksonville media to let them know the day, the time, who was coming, what we were going to talk about. And then I even listed some of the anticipated photos and backdrops that they could have in their shots and their videos. So that would be the media alert. And then the press release would be if you did a press release summing all that work up. So for instance, this week we just edited a press release on our Florida Preservation Award winners. So that isn't necessarily trying to get media to the event, it's telling media what happened at the event. So that's how I kind of just differentiate between those two. And always just keep in mind, if you are having events, to think through if there is a way to invite the media to attend that. That also helps to build your brand and tell your story, and can help support your specific advocacy ask. Social media, obviously, it goes without saying, but you can definitely use social media as an advocacy tool. That image we showed with the demolition review graphic that was shared on social media, the National Trust campaign that they shared, They sent it specifically directly to the email addresses of 16,000 members, but they also shared it on their social media platforms, which really helped. And if you were looking at that kind of sort of grassroots platform, there are some free platforms that you can use that will enable you to plug in your issue, and then folks can log in, click, put in their address, and then sort of like change.org is a good example. Just kind of move that through. It's a good platform for it. But there's also some that you could pay for that way, depending on your needs, you could kind of brand and use more specifically for your needs. But definitely consider social media as you're thinking through your strategy. Another thing that you can absolutely do if you're able is appearing and testifying at committee hearings, and that is really key. That really, I think, helped with the Safe Structures Act. We talked about that fourth strategic piece that we worked on. Of course, Florida's a big state, so it was hard to always get here, but that's why it's nice to do the collaboration, because if you're collaborating with other organizations, they may have people here. We talked already about the grassroots advocacy platforms. I went out of order. And then the final thing that I was going to just call out here specifically is legislative awareness campaigns. So that would be similar to the Miami Design Preservation League's webinars that they did, the weekly legislative updates that we sent throughout session. There are newsletters that organizations send out. All of these things are great tools that you could use to be educated, but you could also do something similar for whatever your audience is and whatever your issues are. So if you were looking for ways to stay informed, which is that kind of behind the scenes communication piece that I think is really important, you can register, you can be added onto our advocacy distribution list. You can just shoot me an email or put your email in the chat if you'd like to be added for next year. You can also go through the Senate and the House and actually set up bill trackers for any legislation that you're interested in keeping an eye on during session. And that is an automated system that will send you emails whenever there's any movement on those pieces of legislation that you're interested in. So that's another great tool that you can use to stay informed. And then in addition to the Florida Trust, there's other organizations that do a great job of sharing updates during the legislative session. Florida's APA, Florida's AIA, Thousand Friends of Florida. Those are just a few groups that do a really great job of communication and advocacy during session. So the last thing we're going to talk about real quick is I want to make sure we left time for questions, and I hope you guys are thinking through some great questions for me, is the importance of collaboration. I know I've kind of mentioned that as we've gone through the other elements of the presentation, but I just wanted to take a moment and really stress that. So here are some of the key collaborators that we've worked with for this past legislative session. So one is the Florida Historic Tax Credit Alliance. We've already talked about that, so we know who that is. The other is the Florida Main Street. Cannot speak enough about how important collaborating with that group is. We have our conference together. The tax credit would be a big incentive, an extra incentive for Main Street communities. I am so passionate about the connection between preservation and economic vitality that Main Streets do. I think that is such a key thing for us. So I just cannot speak enough about the importance of that collaboration. But we also really collaborated with the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and many thanks to them for being as engaged as they are with preservation in Florida. They have a member of the National Trust that is on the Tax Credit Alliance. So that's, remember, an every week conversation is happening, and they're on there and helping to support our initiatives there. They absolutely stepped in and helped with the state structures legislation that we talked about. And then Jen Lindbergh, who's one of the directors for the National Trust, actually came down for our advocacy day this year and sat through all of our meetings that we had with lawmakers, answered questions. He was really engaged, of course, about the tax credit and the Safe Structures bill, but he listened and learned and answered questions for all of the other items as well. They really have been very supportive of preservation in Florida. Another thing I just wanted to mention, you might want to think through this kind of strategy, is a few years ago, 5 years ago, 4 years ago, we had a few years where we did not do well with legislative funding for the Division of Historical Resources grants. There were several years where there was no funding. There was a year where there was very little funding. So sort of people who were engaged and utilized those grants from around the state came together and said, what can we do to do a better job of advocating for the value and the impact to communities for these grants? And so the answer we came up with and we hit on was, well, we need to do a better job of collaborating and speaking together and having more voices speaking more loudly by being together. So we created the Coalition for Florida's Historic Places, and that began not this legislative session, but the session before. And I'm not saying that it's the reason why, but we have had fully funded Division of Historical Resources grants listed for both of those years. So I think that it's worked pretty well. But those were also the 2 years we had those yellow grant books that we showed as a preservation advocacy tool as well. So maybe together all these things move the needle. But the organizations that were in the coalition is Thousand Friends of Florida, the Florida Anthropological Society, the Florida Archaeological Council, the Florida Association of Museums, the Florida Historical Commission, Florida Historical Society, Florida Public Archaeology Network, and then the Florida Trust for Historic Preservation. So a great group of organizations. The missions are very, very similar. They absolutely go together, but they each have their own space. But by working together, we are able to do more. And then finally, I just wanted to call out the great and important work that the Miami Design Preservation League did to fight the legislation we talked about for the Safe Structures Act. That was a really important collaboration for preservationists around the state. So just as a really quick high level look at how they use collaborations for the Safe Structures bill, they worked with elected officials, they worked with cities, and Miami-Dade County, Palm Beach, St. Petersburg. All of these folks came together, had conversations with lawmakers, testified at commissions, had their lobbyists speak on behalf of this. Preservation boards, I think you guys, we've talked about the preservation organizations that were involved, but you can see there was a lot of preservation organizations that were fighting this. And then even other nonprofits that were beyond the scope of traditional historic preservation, like the Florida League of Cities and Thousand Friends of Florida, they were working together on this piece. So just really think through how collaboration can be a part of what you're doing and what you're advocating for. So I know we talked a lot about the state advocacy work that we're doing, because that's what I figured y'all would be most interested in. But I did also want to just mention that the Florida Trust is also very involved in federal advocacy work. So every year we go to DC and we meet with lawmakers and we talk about the importance of historic preservation to communities throughout Florida. We talk about a little bit about what's going on in preservation of Florida. So we have talked about the tax credit with lawmakers in DC. But then we also advocate for preservation initiatives and legislation that is most relevant at the DC level. So we talk about the historic preservation fund, and we talk about fully funding that, and we talk about supporting the historic tax credit and supporting even growing that. So we do lobbying and advocacy at the DC level as well. And if anyone is interested in that level specifically of lobbying, there is an organization called Preservation Action that you might want to follow on social media or become a member of, but they do a great job keeping that kind of year-round drumbeat about what's going on with preservation-related advocacy initiatives in DC. Great job of communicating. And then in March every year, they also have a conference in DC that is in collaboration with the Nick Shippo conference. And so we do some training and we talk about what is going on. We talk about how to advocate. And then the next day we actually go to the Hill and do our advocacy work there. So if you're interested in that, if you would love to do that, it's a really wonderful, very interesting experience. So consider March, putting that, I don't think they've announced the dates yet, but it's usually the second week or third week of March. But consider taking part of that in DC. So here are some ideas for next steps. You can stay informed. I list a couple ways to do that. To build strategy, there's a couple of things we could, if you're an organization that would like to be in the Tax Credit Alliance and set the strategy for how we do that, you can certainly do that. Engage with other organizations. Oh, this lunch and learn is already happening, so just ignore that. But also the Preservation on Main Street conference in Ocala, July 17th, I believe, but Daphne can correct me if I'm wrong and put the right dates in there. I think that will be a great opportunity to connect, to build relationships. There will be lawmakers there. We're going to talk about the tax credit, and we'll also talk a little bit more about advocating and strategy for that. And then if you want to engage with your lawmakers, I would love for you to do that. I hope that you would have the time this summer maybe to host an in-district meeting with your lawmakers. Our regional councils, our state has been divided into 8 regions. Each of those 8 regions is going to work on some ways that we can get engagement with lawmakers while we are out of session. So please keep your eyes peeled and your ears open for that. And then be sure to engage with preservation as asked. So if you get an email that says, please let your lawmaker know this is important, just go ahead and do it. Make your voice heard. And then we have not set yet what specific date our Legislative Advocacy Day is going to be, but it will be in January. And we invite you all, and I hope you'll be able to join us, but to come up to Tallahassee to join us with our meetings with lawmakers. And then after a full day of meeting with lawmakers, we have a reception here at the Florida Trust House. And then we have lawmakers and staff join us here for some fun and some good Florida food. So that's really a very quick Historic Preservation Advocacy 101. I hope that you will unmute and ask me a question if you have it. And then Daphne's done a great job. Thank you, Bill. We'll add you to our distribution list. And Daphne's done a good job putting some links in the chat if you'd like to learn more about our conference or becoming a member or anything else. But I would love to hear from you and answer any questions you might have, or just tell me stories. I see we have Manny Lido from Preserve the Berg in St. Pete. So I would just like to thank you, Manny, for hosting us down there last week and having a wonderful event that was free to the public to talk about the importance of historic preservation, how they can do it in their community. So thank you. Any questions or thoughts? No? Well, thank you so much. Oh, Bill, yes, I see you.
Yeah, quick question. You had mentioned the tax credit, that there was a secondary market for those tax credits.
Yes.
Is that going to be coming when the tax credits come to life? Is that going to be somehow brought to life at the same time?
Yes, if the tax credit is passed, so that would be something that we'd hope for the next legislative session, because it was not passed in 23, but that is included in the bill language that we have currently, is that creation of a secondary market like we talked about.
Okay, and because now I'm not speaking as a member of Preserve the Berg, but as someone who lives in a building that could use the money. If I am a member and on the mailing list, I'll see that tracking through.
Yes, absolutely. And we're going to add
you
you to the advocacy distribution list for sure. And then when we get to session next year, we will have another lunch and learn where we talk more about the specific nuts and bolts about how it would be implemented.
Outstanding. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so I have a question from Luis about a graphic for the Art Heart Old Buildings, and we do, so we can send that out to you. We have your email, I think, Luis, because you registered, so we will send that out to you. But that is a great tool to engage with folks. It's very user-friendly. Everybody gets it. And then Manny had a question. How do you prioritize our initiatives? Any tips or tricks? Yeah, absolutely. So for us, our advocacy initiatives are really set through the board. So we have a retreat and we talk through our strategy, and that's part of what we piece together. And what we focus on is, because we are the statewide nonprofit, we focus on legislation that is going to be scalable and is going to most impact the majority of the state. So that's how we landed on obviously every year we support the DHR grants, that's kind of a given, but that's how we have landed on focusing so much on the tax credit and advocating for that. And then also the historic cemeteries piece. Every year there is usually, since I've been here, and probably forever onwards, there is legislation that we have to be responsive towards. So instead of pushing it through, we are asking for changes to keep it from harming preservation in the state. And so those are always a little trickier, but again, we set those through the board, and we just think, strategically, what is the impact for the state in terms of preservation? But it is definitely challenging, but I will say that having those focus items is really important, because otherwise you can almost be lost in the shuffle. Like, Here is our tracking document, and it's front and back, like 6 pages. These are all of the items we just identified as bills that might impact preservation. And if you try to keep track of all like 35 of them, you're never going to be effective. So I would absolutely advocate for determining strategically which ones are the ones you really want to focus on, because I don't know that you almost kind of water things down a little bit too much if you're trying to do 35 things at once. So hopefully that's helpful. Anybody else have any questions? You can put it in the chat or just unmute and talk to me. I'm happy to do it. Awesome. Well, thank you all so much for being a part of our Lunch and Learn today. And we have recorded it, so we'll have it available for folks if you want to go back and or share it with others. You can certainly do that. And I hope that we will see you in Ocala for Preservation on Main Street. And I hope maybe you can come up here for our Legislative Advocacy Day in January. But I just so very much appreciate all the work you're doing in your communities. So thank you very much. And I hope you all have a great weekend.